Hello everybody, my name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today we're going to be discussing Steven Crowder's divorce, and we're going to be discussing the issue of no-fault divorce. Christian Post wrote an article justifying no-fault divorce using Steven Crowder. Now, as a Christian, I take major issue with that because I think Jesus' words are very clear on the issue of marriage and divorce. I think they're exceedingly clear. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Steven Crowder issue. And Steven Crowder, if you're living under a rock, you're somehow on YouTube and you don't know who Steven Crowder is, which I won't blame you. Steven Crowder is the largest conservative YouTuber with over 6 million subs, I believe, is what he's at. And he has a very public and very ugly divorce that he's hidden for a couple of years now. But it has surfaced, and it's very sad. And I'm actually pretty sad to talk about it because, on the issue of marriage, if I can get a little personal here, if my wife and I were not Bible-believing Christians, we wouldn't be married still. So, what makes me sad about the situation that Steven Crowder is going through and Hillary Crowder is going through is that they could have had, my story of fighting to keep a marriage alive, but I guess they've taken the easy way out. So I'm kind of saddened by that. And I don't like talking about it, but, we have an article written at Evangelical Dark Web that my brother wrote, and we're going to use that as the backdrop for talking about this article that Christian Post wrote and the larger picture of Steven Crowder's divorce and whether no-fault divorce is biblically justified or not because of a high-profile instance. But first, let me know, going to let you know that Evangelical Dark Web is a Christian news gathering and commentary ministry. You can support us over at evangelicaldarkweb.org/join. That's our Patreon-like system because we don't use Patreon because they censor, hardcore censorship. So we don't want to support that. So we built our own. You can also check out the free newsletter that's linked in the description below. That gives you Christian news in your inbox each and every morning, bypassing big tech censorship as well. But the least you can do is like the video and also subscribe to the channel if you are new. So this is the article by Christian Post. It's written by Sarah McDougal, who's a feminist grifter in the church. So this is the article that Anthony wrote at Evangelical Dark Web. So we're going to be talking about this. Is Steven Crowder's divorce justified? Christian Post says yes. He begins by saying 2023 has been a year of shakeup in the conservative media sphere, with the biggest names involved in high-profile drama, which is drastically revealing. Among these conservatives is Steven Crowder. Crowder made headlines late last year when he announced his departure from The Blaze. In 2023, his negotiations with the Daily Wire created drama in the media space, whereby Jeremy Boring placed terms in his contract that would financially penalize him for falling afoul of big tech censorship. Ironically, Matt Walsh is demonetized on YouTube. That is pretty ironic. While Crowder championed himself as sticking up for the little guy in the content space, debates over a $50 million contract and his lack of history platforming smaller conservatives in the muddle of his altruistic motives. So there's a lot of, hypocrisy surrounding Steven Crowder. I think that's pretty clear for anyone who's following the Steven Crowder situation. Then came the Dave Landau, Michael Malice interview, where Landau called out Crowder's abusive micromanagement, while Crowder was correct in his grievance against Jeremy Boring's term sheets. His hypocrisy towards Landau and others on his staff is equally appalling. So that's kind of the thing about Steven Crowder. Here, me and my brother, we've had a very, up and down relationship with Steven Crowder. I was a big fan of Steven Crowder a number of years ago. But the thing about Steven Crowder is, I felt that he had lost it. Like, the eye of the tiger was not there. And perhaps this divorce is one of the reasons why the eye of the tiger is not there anymore. Although I'd say it started in 2020. But nonetheless, the eye of the tiger is not there. You got a lot of conservative gatekeeping. Like, he's not that pro-life. Like, he's a feminist on the issue of abortion, and that's not biblical whatsoever. And then he gatekeeps against people who are more pro-life and certainly more conservative than he is. So those are a lot of the issues with Steven Crowder. And then you get this behind-the-scenes drama, which he's had a lot of behind-the-scenes drama over the last few years. Not on the most amicable terms with his previous co-host. So these are just facts about Steven Crowder. In April, it was announced that Steven Crowder was getting a divorce from his wife Hillary, who he married in 2012. The couple had twins in the summer of 2021 and subsequently filed for divorce later that year. After airing his announcement on his show Behind the Paywall, this was subsequently followed up by the released security footage depicting Crowder verbally abusing his then 8-month pregnant wife while lounging on the patio. And by lounging, he means smoking a cigar too. Like, it's very, very casual Steven Crowder was while he was expecting his wife to labor. So, again, I saw a meme that was, POV when you're Steven Crowder. It's a dude smoking a cigar while his pregnant wife mows the lawn. Like, that's the type of behavior we were seeing from Steven Crowder was depicted in that meme. This was then followed by a New York Post article which alleged in detail the sexually lewd workplace antics involving genital exposure amongst other hostilities. Like, the genital exposure, wow, it was really gay. But in a power struggle kind of way. Like, he's trying to show dominance. That's basically the gist that I got. He's whipping it out to show dominance. That's basically what Steven Crowder was doing. So enter Christian Post. Oh, wait, no, I still had more on that. Back up here. Plainly stated, the video and its contents are reprehensible, even if selectively edited. However, we as Christians should not judge 10 years of marriage by 5 minutes of video, nor should we exchange biblical teaching for situational ethics. It is probable and perhaps unsurprising that Crowder's workplace diva persona impacted the marriage, at least that was evident in the video. Regardless, there was much more that transpired in that marriage leading to that incident. So it is insensible to white knight for the woman that or otherwise take personal interest in entirely private affairs. And I think that's very true. Again, I didn't selectively edit this to match my opinion, but I do believe that's true. Anthony's not married. I am. And you don't get to the point where you're telling your 8-month pregnant wife you don't love her anymore overnight. You don't get there overnight. Obviously, that doesn't justify the end result and where the car ended up driving off, the cliff that the car ended up driving off of. That's not justified whatsoever. But you don't get there overnight. Just as Rome wasn't built in a day, neither was that a destroyed marriage like on that level built in one day either. So, enter Christian Post, which published an op-ed by Sarah McDougal entitled Steven Crowder and No Fault Divorce. McDougal is a trauma counselor who endured an allegedly abusive marriage and subsequently deconstructed her faith from the 1990s purity culture. She is an egalitarian who sells life coaching services. In this article, she attacks Emerson Eggerichs and his ideas presented in love and respect, ultimately blaming the prevalence of Eggerichs' views for Crowder's actions. And this is a quote from the McDougal article. If his own actions are any indication, Crowder's worldview aligns closely with Eggerichs. Despite positioning himself as a champion for Christian marriage, Crowder clearly felt perfectly entitled to treat his wife as he did, and there is absolutely nothing she could have done to hold him accountable except to leave. And again, that's not biblically true. The four spheres of sovereignty exist to keep each other in check. I don't believe that she was beyond going to the church for recourse. There was nothing in that video that was irreconcilable, nor was divorce the only option. The great tragedy in this situation is that Crowder was a champion of abstinence and purity before marriage, something that is exceedingly rare these days. The degradation of the marriage did not happen in any of the footage that had been leaked, but doubtless happened over time. Holding Crowder accountable by divorce is not a desirable outcome, as McDougall alludes. A family has been destroyed. Yeah. And the stats don't lie about that. And this is another quote from the McDougall article. But just leaving is far harder than it might sound. Since his divorce, Crowder is loudly vocal about repealing no-fault divorce laws. On the surface, it sounds good to some as a solution to keep Christian families together, but is something more sinister under the surface. And I want to pause right there to say maybe for Steven Crowder it is. Maybe for Steven Crowder, his, I don't want to call it a crusade because I don't think he's gone that far. His rant about no-fault divorce could very well be motivated to have further hidden his moral failings in his private life. That could be his motivation, that he regrets and has remorse, not repentance, but remorse for the failure of his marriage. That could be it. But that doesn't make no-fault divorce biblically justified. In the United States, when divorce is granted without requiring one party to prove that the other party is at fault for the failure of the marriage, it is called no-fault divorce. Cornell University's Legal Information Institute explains traditional fault grounds for divorce are adultery, cruelty, confinement in prison, physical inability to have sexual intercourse, really, and incurable insanity. Today, all states allow no-fault divorce, but about 2/3 of the states also still allow couples to obtain divorce based on fault grounds. So I guess it's fine to bail on your marriage if your spouse is in an accident and can't have sex anymore. To Christians who are enthusiastically supportive of marriage, the concept of no-fault divorce may sound like a blank check for a society-wide attack on morality. Yes. And it actually has been. The implementation of no-fault divorce did damage to entire, and this is outside the quote, implantation of no-fault divorce did damage to an entire generation of Americans who grew up in divorced homes. At one point, divorce was a 50-50 outcome for marriage, only to recede as society no longer values marriage as an institution. Which is true, because they say, you have heard that, marriage is like a coin flip whether it lasts or not. But, that's statistically not true. It's actually not as true for first timers as it is for second and third timers because, again, they've already had one divorce. They're just going to keep doing it again. So that's part of how that statistic got to where it's at. But yeah, now that our society doesn't, get married as much, divorce rates have actually gone down. Rather than work out marital struggles, couples divorced and took their baggage with them. And the divorce rates on remarriages is about 60%. Statistically speaking, the grass is not greener on the other side. So the societal emphasis should fixate towards improving marriages, not upgrading spouses. But rather than apply rational thought, McDougall employs hyperbole to condemn at-fault divorce on grounds of impotence, which in marriages is most commonly erectile dysfunction. Note that Dennis Prager uses a similar hyperbole to justify pornography. This is her self-projection emanating from the wounds of her previous marriage. And another note that I want to make about the erectile dysfunction comment is, what's the biggest, cause of erectile dysfunction? It's porn use. It's being a coomer. That is the biggest cause of erectile dysfunction, is people being coomers while being married. So they need drugs to get it up and to keep it up. because they've trained their bodies, they've trained their phallus a certain way, if you know what I'm saying. That's about as graphic as I'm going to get on this. Christians who uphold the traditional values of lifelong commitment understandably recoil at the idea of allowing a partner, this is a McDougall quote, by the way, to change their mind whenever they want. But is that really what no fault divorce allows? I'd like to suggest that we look deeper to assess our own underlying biases. And Anthony goes on to say, what bias is there to assess? No-fault divorce allows a woman to file divorce and to take half a man's money and assets rather than work towards improving the marriage. There's a reason women initiate 70% of divorce, which rises to 90% if college educated. They do not all have abusive alcoholic husbands who cheated on their wives. In fact, 23% of females and 19% of men are victimized by domestic violence, which is nearly even. It's within a standard deviation margin for error, perhaps, I guess is why he's saying that. 21.2% of women have taken medication for mental health treatment in the last 12 months, nearly double the 11.5% of men. It also cannot be ignored that the sexual behavior before marriage correlates with divorce. A woman with 6 or more premarital sexual partners, basically, if a woman has a body count of 6 or higher, they are almost 3 times less likely to be in a stable marriage. One cannot ignore the widespread damage these patterns of dysfunctional behaviors have on an entire society, especially when repeated in subsequent generations, thus destroying the nuclear family. McDougall would have us rethink one of the fruits of the sexual revolution. So this is where she justifies no-fault divorce as life-saving, is what this section's about. In 1969, states began passing no-fault divorce laws one at a time. Researchers were fascinated by the results. Gretchen Baskerville, author of Life-Saving Divorce, explains, in states that have passed unilateral no-fault divorce, suicide rate for wives dropped by 8 to 16%. The domestic violence rate by and against both men and women dropped by 30%. The homicide rate of women murdered by an intimate dropped by 10%. Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, a researcher, inventor of the danger assessment, and professor at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, states that that in her danger assessment certification training, the safest states for women who face domestic violence are the states with the lowest rates of women killing men. Why? Because for their partners living with intimate terrorism, societal infrastructure such as domestic violence shelters and no-fault divorce provide an alternative path to safety other than death. So that's the end of the quote from the article. No-fault divorce is necessary because it saves lives. That's the argument that they're making. Where have Christians heard this narrative before? The Rainbow Jihad argues that child mutilation is necessary to prevent suicides. And I'll add something to that. They also argue that banning change therapy is justified to prevent suicides, even though that the studies don't show that it causes suicide. They've done multiple studies that show that it doesn't do that. Similarly, they also argue abortion is necessary to prevent dangerous back alley procedures. Shutting down the economy and imposing lockdowns was necessary to save lives. Then there's the gun control being necessary to save lives. This is a false canard that the left has propagated for years and should be rejected. Divorce destroys families and traumatizes children. Statistically, divorce begets further dysfunction for both parents and their offspring. And, this is factored in crime as well. For Christians raised in and raising their children in loving, safe homes, this is back to the McDougall article, the concept of being forced to choose between hell at home or death may seem unfathomable, but those who have experienced abuse can imagine it easily. To the causal onlooker, the idea of requiring one partner to prove that the other is in fact at fault may seem quite reasonable, but to those who have been forced to navigate the American family court system, know just how difficult, if not impossible, it can be to prove, well, anything at all. It is and that's the end of the quote from the article. It is entirely reasonable, and still is, either marriage is an institution considered sacred, requiring a high burden of proof for dissolution, or it is not. When the New Testament was written, marriage was hardly considered sacred, which is why the Pharisees probed Jesus in Matthew 19 on marriage and divorce. Likewise, Greco-Roman society was loose on divorce and marital infidelity, requiring rebuke by the apostles. Divorce should not be easy nor comfortable. To then argue that the difficulty of proving claims in family court necessitates no-fault divorce is ludicrous and disingenuous. When marriages break apart, petty behavior metastasizes, which then becomes entangled at the courts. Nevertheless, family court is generally favorable to women versus men, around 90% of custodial parents being women, albeit most of them through settlement. In this situation, the mother can restart with the children, child support, and alimony, and the prospects of remarriage to start anew. It should also be said that the states that only have no-fault divorce do not factor marital infidelity when granting the divorce and settlement of assets, custody, etc. Ironically, this hurts women, as men are more likely to cheat at 20% versus 13%, though women under 30 are slightly more adulterous. That's a shock. Said no one ever. Correlating factors for infidelity include lack of religious service attendance, two-parent homes, Democrats, and disparate impact of black men, 28%. States that considered fault grounds for divorce do factor this into the settlement, which would disproportionately benefit women. McDougall proceeds to call out Crowder and focus on the family for bashing no-fault divorce, citing the timeline of Crowder's statements coinciding with his own divorce. She then concludes, "Let me be very clear. While I work in the abuse recovery field, I am for marriage. I believe in a biblical family, lifelong commitment, and loving companionship. I also recognize that black and white thinking can create affinity for solutions that naively overlook life-threatening risk and nuances. If we want to build marriages and families that are reflective of Christ's healing safety, we must carefully consider all angles. To explore those angles more," then she starts advertising her own nonsense. "We must look at the whole picture of what Scripture has to say about dealing with dangerous people, not just parts. Towards the end, as you assess your stance on social issues, include questions like, in what ways can we uphold healthy families and loving marriages while having zero tolerance for abuse? In civil institution of marriage, is a civil institution of marriage more valuable than the life and well-being of those abused within its confines?" Is how she concludes. You cannot be for marriage and for the dissolution of marriage without just cause. It is unbecoming of a Christian to wantonly advocate divorce, just as it is ridiculous that the Christian Post would publish such a piece. Whatever McDougall endured in marriage, she is projecting her dissatisfaction onto others and monetizing her own service and materials, which is itself despicable. She assumes that women need no-fault divorce as an option, which is exactly what liberals say on abortion. The availability of no-fault divorce as an option incentivizes divorce. Rather than teach women to make better life choices, reject promiscuity, choose a good man, and practice emotional self-control, McDougall instead uses the tragic demise of Stephen Crowder's marriage to celebrate Hillary's liberation from his abuse and bash complementarianism. Crowder demonstrated failings as a husband and father, which will likely leave a stain on his career, which they will. Certainly, the yes men that surrounded Crowder, including his father, failed to confront his indiscretions on set, which clearly impacted his marriage. Likewise, leaking the damaging recordings through a heathen reporter is shameful, vindictive behavior. Like, seriously, if you're leaking your stuff to Yashar Ali, like, you're shady too. It's like when we talked about Han Cho a couple months ago, going to the Christian Christianity Today to badmouth John MacArthur and Grace Community Church. Like, I don't know, maybe go to somewhere credible. None of these shortcomings negate scriptural teaching on divorce, marriage, or reconciliation. What Jesus said about divorce in Matthew 19 is still a command today. What Jesus said about confronting one's brother in Matthew 18 is still the standard for reconciling sin even now. Reconciliation, even between spouses, should be conducted with the intention of winning over on a good brother in faith, not maligning him publicly. What Paul wrote in Ephesians 5, which is not mutual submission, but male headship, is still applicable today. Maybe if more people adhered to Scripture, there would be fewer broken marriages and families would be strengthened. And that's how Anthony concludes. I also want to say, as a Christian nationalist myself, I believe we should go back to having mandatory at-fault divorce in every state. We should not have no-fault divorce. That has destroyed the family. That has attacked the family. It was a bad move on government policy. In one extreme example in Steven Crowder, and even the others don't justify it, because our society has seen the brokenness that has ensued from no-fault divorce. It's just undeniable. So I want to end on that note. But anyway, that's all I got to say about that for today. Let me know what you think about what I think in the comment section below. Have a blessed day, and I will catch you on the next one.